Good evening. I'm Mike Perry, the Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. We're the Friends Group for the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Tonight, we're pleased to have a more recent talk, even though it's still back in the early period of the Cold War, but that's recent for some of us. We have tonight is Charles Rick Estberg. He's recently retired after a 45 career with the Army and National Security Agency. He served 4 years on active duty as a linguist in West Berlin. In his 40-plus years at the NSA, he had numerous positions to include Director Speechwriter, Senior Foreign Relations Officer, Intelligence Advisor to EUCOM and NATO International Military Staff, and Chief of Staff of the Interagency OPSEC Support Group. He was selected as a Brookings Legislative Fellow in 1997. For over 10 years, he was the NSA's premier briefer and public speaker, addressing audiences totaling more than 35,000 individuals, to include the Director of the FBI, Secretary of the Treasury, and over 24 senior military intelligence leaders. He holds a BA in German and Education from College in Wisconsin and in History from the University of Maryland. He was awarded a master's degree in the field of international relations from Boston University. Rick, welcome. Hope we have a good attendance tonight, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Boy, after a nice introduction like that, the only person who would think that I'd be the one standing up is my mom. She's not here. I want to thank you very much for allowing me to address this august body. I think I represent a couple of extremes. First of all, I may be the lowest ranking person that's ever addressed this group. I left the Army after 4 years as an E5. But I may also, at the other end of the spectrum, represent one of the more senior presenters here, in that I represent 45 years of Department of Defense experience. When I was 19, I came to the first fork in the road as a very young adult. I had to make a command decision. I was at Ripon College in Wisconsin, getting ready to begin my junior year, and had to decide, do I take the normal path, the one that just means 4 years at Ripon and then graduate with a BA? Or do I do what my German professor has suggested, and that is take the plunge and go take advantage of the junior year abroad program at a university in Bonn in Germany? So I came to this fork in the road, and as the famous German philosopher Schopenhauer once said, or was it Yogi Berra? I always get these two mixed up. I think it was Yogi when he said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And so I did. I took the one less traveled by, as the poet wrote, and that has made all the difference. And of course, the poet, Jack Frost, or maybe his brother. And so I decided to make my junior year abroad in the university located in Bonn, Germany. Next slide, please. That's your cue. There we go. Here it is, Friedrich Wilhelms Universität in Bonn, on the banks of the Rhine. And it's safe to say that that decision made as a 19-year-old young adult affected every single thing that would happen for the rest of my adult life. It all hinged on that one fork in the road. This was quite an experience for a 19-year-old kid to come and study at a school like this. You probably have heard of some of the graduates from this university. They include Karl Marx, Heinrich Heine, Friedrich Nietzsche, Konrad Adenauer, Joseph Goebbels, and another fellow whose name seemed to ring a bell when I first heard it, Joseph Ratzinger. I seem to recall drinking wine, very, very cheap wine, Lambrusco. We would buy it 3 liters for 3 marks, I think. Tuesday was a good day for wine. I seem to recall drinking with him along the banks of the Rhine, somebody by that name. But when I saw him again for the next time, decades later, he had become Pope Benedict. So I'm not really positive that that was one and the same. But what happened here in this year, something very formative. I took on a love of everything foreign in general and a love of everything German in particular, and decided all of my earlier plans, which was to become a high school teacher, were now out the window. New plans. I would do anything to get back to Germany. The problem was I really didn't have a clue how to do that. And then a friend of mine suggested, have you ever considered the military? I knew nothing about the military. My father served all of World War II in Marfa, Texas, teaching Taiwanese pilots how to fly, and he himself didn't know how to fly. I knew nothing. I thought that a private saluted a sergeant and a sergeant saluted a first sergeant. And bottom line was, I was a babe in the woods, but it did seem to sound like a good plan. So I thought, okay, 4 options. Marines, no, I don't want to kill any Germans. I just want to go live in Germany. Navy, again, I didn't exactly know an awful lot about the services. Navy, well, what could they possibly have in Berlin? No chance. So that really made it a choice between 2, Air Force, Army. Well, obviously, picturing yourself in the back seat of a 2-seat fighter jet listening to Russians through headphones, this definitely sounded like the way to go. So I went into the Air Force recruiter's office in San Jose, California. They and the Army were next door to each other, and said, I've got a college degree. I want to come in as an enlisted guy. I'm fluent in German. I've taken 3 years of college Russian. Do you have any of those people in the Air Force that you send to Germany who you call linguists, I think? And his response was nothing if not brief, 2 letters, no, we don't. Okay, went next door to the Army, told him the same story, and not to put too fine a point on it, the guy nearly soiled himself. A college graduate walking in the door saying, I'd be glad to come into the Army as a PFC. I'll sign a contract today for 4 years if you will send me to Germany. So the deal was done. I joined the Army, signed that contract, and was sent to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, but not for further German studies, instead for Russian, where the need was far, far greater. Next slide. I can't say I really recognize this fellow too much, but this picture was taken in 1975, late 75. And if you can read the small print on the name tag, you see that it's Estberg with a slash and then RU. So it would show exactly what language you were studying at DLI. Now, in those days, you came in as a PFC if you had a college degree. As long as you committed no felonies in the first 90 days, you were automatically promoted to Spec 4. And if you finished at the top of your class, what we called your AIT or your advanced training, you got promoted again, which means I made E5 in 1 year in the military, which also means I never had a chance to get promoted again in the next 3 years because it had all happened so quickly. 9 years at the language school, 9 months, sorry, at the language school learning Russian, followed by 4 months, the summer of 1976, at Goodfellow Air Force Base in San Angelo, Texas, and then wheels up on a Pan Am flight, sending me into the brand new airport of Berlin, Tegel Airport, where I landed in November 1976. Now, the book that I've written, which I'll talk about at the very end, it tells the tales, nearly all of them are true as best I can tell, of 7 years living in walled Berlin, 3 of them as an E5 in the Army, and then 4, just a few years later, as the National Security Agency civilian. The focus on the book is naturally not on the specifics of what I did on the job, because the book had to be pre-pub reviewed by the National Security Agency, and I was thrilled to see that it made it through with no redactions whatsoever. I really was expecting quite a bit. But instead, I focused on some of the unusual, the exciting, the remarkable, the noteworthy, the just fascinating experiences that came from living and working inside walled West Berlin. Now, some of those experiences that I discuss in the book as a single 22, 23-year-old are a bit crass, a bit raw, a bit immature, and maybe even a tad bit bawdy. And yes, I was. The book was meant to reflect what it was like to be someone that young, having such an awesome responsibility, holding a top secret SCI clearance, trying to do his part to save the free world out there. Most of us were a little bit on the young side, but we had a couple of things. We were proud, we were serious about what we were doing, important everything it was that we were doing. Next slide, please. My first day on this lovely facility, Teufelsberg, T-Berg, it's called Trümmerberg, which in German means rubble mountain, Teufelsberg, which means Devil's Mountain. It's the highest site in West Berlin. which isn't saying very much. That's like saying the highest site in Florida or Delaware, but it was based on a hill made of rubble from World War II and sitting at about 350 feet above sea level. That was considered a mountain in West Berlin. Well, I arrived on my very first day. E5, Russian linguist, walked into the building, and the warrant officer in charge of my section says, well, you took the Russian transcription test. You did pretty well, but it says here you know German. How good is your German? I said, a hell of a lot better than my Russian, sir. He said, we'll see. He brought me over to a civilian. Obviously, I had no idea who this person was, sat me down next to him, gave me a pair of what we call tin cans, headphones, and he said, Jim, tell me if this guy's any good. So there I was sitting next to this civilian stranger. He hit the play button on the TNH-11 tape recorder. He let it run for about 10 minutes and he said, what are they talking about? I said, well, it's not German I'm used to hearing, but it apparently is East German communists, and they're talking about some big party conference coming up in Dresden later on in the year and who all the main speakers will be. We took off our headphones. The civilian turned to the warrant officer and said, he's good, he'll do. And so from that day, the warrant officer said, you're no longer a Russian linguist, you're now a German linguist. The man, by the way, was Jim Cusick, NSA civilian who would be my mentor, would go on to become the senior NSA representative at the Army Field Station, not only in Berlin, but also in Augsburg, and would end his career by being the director of NSA's Foreign Relations section for several years. Now they called me a German linguist, and the rest, as they say, is history. Living in the barracks where we civilian folks were housed was certainly a novel experience in itself, especially compared to the buildings I had seen in Monterey and at Goodfellow. Next slide, please. This was my home. Completed in 1878 as unified Germany's brand new West Point, in effect, it had great military significance. So much so that after World War I, the Versailles Treaty specifically demanded that Germany close the facility down. And so from 1919 until 1933, it became nothing more than a regular trade school. But then, 1933, a couple of new units move in, some SA units and some SS units. It was at this very facility that in late June 1934, the Night of the Long Knives took place. SA and the SS, I guess, decided this barracks just wasn't big enough for the two of us. So it ended up that the SA was really, and hoped it, as they would say, they had their head cut off. That was the end of the SA being such a powerful force. The SS took over the entire facility, and it became the home of the most famous SS unit, the bodyguard unit for Adolf Hitler personally, the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. And it would remain so for the rest of the war until 1945. Now, if you look at the list of some of the folks who came through this facility, my goodness, it's a who's who of famous German military figures of the 20th century. Some of the folks who occupied this barracks prior to me arriving included folks like General Ludendorff, Baron von Richthofen, Hermann Göring, Generals von Rundstedt, von Witzleben, and von Schleicher. It was the who's who of the Wehrmacht. And of course, the SS unit here was famous for not only guarding Adolf Hitler, but also all of the buildings in downtown Berlin. They were the honor guard, if you will. Next slide, please. The facilities were damaged, but not damaged too terribly in World War II. And on July 4th, 1945, the facilities were turned over to the US by the Soviets who had captured the entire city. You can see that there had barely been time to do much cleanup work here when we took over the building on July 4th. You can read the word Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler still up on the top of the building. The swastika is gone. Somebody took the time and trouble to blow that up, but they didn't have enough time to do the rest. We would rename it as Andrews Barracks, and it would remain the home of many different military units, to include Field Station Berlin, for the next 44 years. So this is where the headquarters elements of Field Station Berlin were located, but it was also the home of all single male and female folks assigned to this unit. Next slide, please. So this is my building. This is what the housing was for us. Obviously a little bit different again from Monterey and from Texas, living in a building that was well over a century old. unless you have.
Rick, you're muted.
Let me unmute. Let's see what happened here.
You lost something right when you switched over to the new barracks. You switched out for a second.
Okay, well, I'm back here, and we can see today that this is now the German Federal Archives building, protected, so it will never be torn down. About the only other facilities on the installation that were kept include the training pool for the 1936 Olympics, which is still there as well. Next slide, please. So here was the facility, T-Berg, Teufelsberg, the hill. There were 1,200 of us here assigned. It was interesting because that was a number that was 0% a decade earlier. And by the time the field station was closed, that number was probably well over 30 or 40%. And lo and behold, guess who was a tenant here at this facility? 20% of all of the personnel on Teufelsberg were blue suiters. They were Air Force, and most of them were, in fact, yes, linguists. So that Air Force recruiter kind of blew it. He had his chance, but that's okay. It worked out fine for me joining the Army. There were also some Brits located in the building here, British Signals Unit, but we never had anything to do with them. They lived under their own rules there, and the only time we ever saw them was at the chow hall. Otherwise, no contact whatsoever. Now, on the third floor of this building, well, the radomes obviously are covering antennas. On the third floor, the top floor of the blue building, that's where the collection took place. It's important to note for any of you who are in the intelligence business, how life has changed since the 1970s and 80s. For those of you not familiar, what we were involved with was signals intelligence, SIGINT. It comprises 3 subsets going from least famous to most famous. At the bottom would be FISINT, Foreign Instrumentation Signals Intelligence. This is normally telemetry, beaconry. We had nothing to do with that in these days. This was pre-FISINT days. Next would be ELINT, Electronic Intelligence, or non-communications intelligence, normally associated with radar systems. This was not worked here either, but instead was worked primarily by the Air Force at other locations as they monitored the air defense around Berlin. And finally, the granddaddy of them all, COMINT, Communications Intelligence. This is where SCI lived, code words and things like that. This is what we were involved in for decades here. And you need to recognize that the technology from the 1950s through the 1980s was proceeding at glacial speed. There were almost no changes whatsoever to the technology. It was an HF microwave world, which meant that if your opponent, your target, was sitting at 1878 megahertz yesterday, he will be at 1878 megs today, and he will be the same place tomorrow. If you point your antenna in these radomes at a particular tower that you're intercepting, you will not need to move the antenna again, potentially for years. This was the nature of technology in these days. Now, the downside, though, was in these days of pre-satellite collection, you had to be up close and personal to your targets. The closer you could get to those enemy targets, the better. This explains why we, NSA, and the military had so many of these huge overseas field stations from the 50s through the 1980s. The Army maintained 3 very large facilities, 2 of them in Germany, this one. Field Station Augsburg in Bavaria, which was massive. It was almost twice the size of ours. And on the cliffs above the Black Sea, Sinop in Turkey. But the Army was not alone. The Air Force also had facilities down in southern Italy, and Vito de Normandie. There was Chicksands. The Navy had a site at Rota, Spain, not to mention Bad Aibling Station in Bavaria and Menwith Hill Station in the UK. And somewhat similarly in Asia, and to a much smaller degree in Latin America, the need for all of these massive sites was because we couldn't do anything with the signals to take them anywhere else, unlike today. We had to go up and meet the signal up on their territory. And the closer you could get to those towers, the better your chances of getting meaningful intercept. And we in Berlin, as we'll see in just a minute, had the absolute, what I call LOL, luxury of location. We were 110 miles inside the communist target country. And if you climbed out on the roof of this building and looked due east on a clear day, which means, well, never, you could actually see the television tower in East Berlin, and you could see the microwave dishes that we were intercepting at a range of probably no more than 6 or 7 miles as the crow flies. So the signals were intercepted on the 3rd floor. The folks who manned the racks up there, and there were numerous racks of collection equipment, I always felt sorry for. These were linguists who didn't do very well in language school, or they didn't do well in the transcription test when they arrived, and so they were relegated to being collectors upstairs. It was not a very fun job. We called it spin and grin. That's all they did. They would turn on the racks of tape recorders. They could listen in if they wanted to, but it honestly didn't matter, because at the end of 30 minutes, they would hit stop, rewind, take the tape out, put it in an orange jacket, and send it downstairs to us, the senior linguists, to process. Now, some of these folks upstairs were actually very talented people, and I felt very, very sorry for them because they never got the luxury of being a transcriber or a real analyst. Once in a while, if these good linguists saw or heard something that was important, they would write down notes on a piece of paper of what they heard. They did not have the luxury I did. They couldn't rewind. It was live. So they would jot down whatever they thought they heard, put the piece of paper in the tape jacket, and when it came down to me and the senior linguist downstairs, we would pull out that piece of paper, and if it looked significant, we would listen to that tape first. Because every hour, we probably received somewhere between 30 and 60 different tapes, which may have nothing on them, or they may have been full on various channels of intercept. Next slide, please. This was the primary radio target that we were going after, the RVG 934, RVG 924. These were 24-channel, multi-channel systems used primarily for our targets by the East German Communist Party, the SED, Socialist Unity Party, and by the East German Ministry of Defense. That was the target that I was going after, the NVA, the East German People's Army, and their headquarters. They were not encrypted. Hard as it may be to believe, by the late 80s, there was still no encryption widely used among the East German military. Can't really talk much about what the Soviets there had, but the East Germans were not the recipients of any of this, which meant that these senior folks really only had 2 choices. They could speak over landline, and landline is not really very effective over 300 miles, or they could do what we commenters pray that they will do: talk around the subject. Folks, it doesn't work any better for us than it did for the East German military. We can figure out what you're talking about very, very easily because we monitor you guys 24/7. We know what your topics of interest are. So as the person would bring the tapes would be delivered to me, and I'd take out this piece of paper. One day something caught my attention. It said Warsaw Pact, and right there you've got my attention. That's the East equivalent of NATO, of course. Warsaw Pact meeting in, and then apparently a location. It was 4 letters long with a capital L. It was LODZ. I thought, what the hell is this? There's no East German town called Lodz or Lotz. What could this possibly be? This makes no sense whatsoever. So, of course, the foolish person upstairs who's not a very good linguist, he just made a big mistake, or she did. So I put the tape up and listened to it, and it got even weirder. Yes, they were talking about a Warsaw Pact meeting coming up, but it sure as hell wasn't in Lodz. It sounded like whoosh. This is crazy. Not only is there no Lodz in East Germany, I guarantee there's no whoosh, because the w sound doesn't even exist in German, or in Russian for that matter. Well, I had to pick something, so I got out the German Gazetteer and found some location that was remotely like it, but honestly, not even very close. Did my transcript. Transcripts were done on manual typewriters on what we affectionately called Zwei-ply, 2-ply paper. You tear off one piece and put it in the tape jacket for the NSA civilian to re-listen to if he felt it was worthwhile. The NSA people there were the gods. They were the senior linguists. They controlled our linguistic output. They had nothing to do, obviously, with military policy of haircuts and boots and things like that, but they would quality control all of our work. Well, One day, right after this, as a matter of fact, one of the NSA civilians, a very quiet gentleman named Dave, came up to me. He said, Rick, I wanted to compliment you first on your work here. You've really become a real asset, and we think you've got great things ahead of you. And I said, well, sure, I knew that. And he said, but you would agree, would you not, that if the NSA civilians think they hear something, you probably ought to believe them, right? They're probably correct. Would you agree? Absolutely. You guys are the kings of the language. Sure. I'd never question you. Oh, good, he said. And he pulled out the little piece of paper out of that tape. And he said, take a look at this. I said, oh, that one. My God, what a howler that one was. I don't know who the fool was that came up with LODs, but it sure doesn't come up like that. He said, well, actually, I was the one who listened to this tape. I was bored yesterday. We had a lot of backlog, so I put the tape up. And you don't by any chance know Polish, do you? I said, no, I just know German and Russian. Come with me, he said. Let me show you a map here. Took me over to a full wall map of the Warsaw Pact, from the Soviet Union out to East Germany, the inner German border. And what do you think is right square in the middle of that map? This massive Polish city called Lodz, or as they like to call it, Łódź. Well, I crawled back to my position and learned two very, very important lessons from this whole fiasco. First, a little bit of humility. And second, learn to know the NSA civilians' handwriting so you never make this mistake again. Well, let's take a look at who we were primarily interested in as my mission while I was in Berlin. Next slide, please. Well, here they are, Mr. Big ×2. The gentleman on the right is Erich Honecker, the head of the East German Communist Party, head of the Central Committee. He was one of only two men to hold this position until the last few weeks of the East German regime. Prior to him was Walter Ulbricht, and then in a coup, Honecker took over. Honecker was behind the building of the Berlin Wall in the summer of 1961. So he was your political #1 target. If you could ever get this guy on the line, wow, that would be exciting. Kind of like, I don't know, walking down the street where you live and seeing a president or seeing a 4-star general or some famous actress, perhaps. The man on the left is Army General Karl-Heinz Hoffmann, an old freedom fighter from the days when the Nazis and the communists were battling it out in the cities and streets in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. He was the Minister of Defense. He was my primary target. In other words, I did the military side of things. Other folks worked the political side. To dream of him coming up on the line, or even his adjutant, his secretary, his deputy, meant you've got some pretty high-powered intercept here. So this was our primary target, was the leadership, because obviously any indications of upcoming exercises, VIP travel, Warsaw Pact meetings, or something even more sinister, such as invading your neighbor, such as what happened with Czechoslovakia in 1968, some of the tip-offs to that actually came from the monitoring of folks such as these two. Next slide, please. What other things did we care about in the military realm? Well, we definitely worried about frogs. They were the younger cousins of Scud missiles, made famous later on in other wars. The Scuds were around, but they were a little bit newer and a little bit more sophisticated. They didn't seem to be quite so mobile. We really were worried about the Frog 7s, the NATO designator for this weapon system, because they could carry nuclear or chemical warheads, and they were extremely mobile. I mean, you can see these things can move just about anywhere at any time, and they don't even have to get on the radio to talk, which meant we really had to be extremely careful as to where these folks were at all times. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there were the traditional troops who would exercise all across the countryside. Within East Germany, there were 6 infantry divisions. Couple that with 20 Soviet divisions, and later on they took out the weakest one and made it 19. But for all intents and purposes, West Berlin was surrounded by 26 hostile infantry divisions. It was not exactly a fair fight, so to speak, if World War III had broken out. The first time I went to East Berlin and saw the Goose Step was in 1974 as a college kid. And all I could do was think of, what do the old time Germans think about this? It had only been under 30 years early where you had Nazis storming around like this. And now here in the 70s, and of course much earlier as well, you've got the East German NVA, the National People's Army, doing the same Steckstritt that Hitler made famous. I did a little bit of research and found out that actually the Steckstritt goes all the way back to the mid 1700s. I guess the Prussians invented it, and it became extremely widely used, most famously in recent times, of course, though, by the entire Warsaw Pact countries, by Russia and all of the other Warsaw Pact nations. Obviously, the West Germans did not use this. The East Germans decided they needed to change the name of it, though, because it had bad historical connotations. So they changed it to be Exerzierstritt. But that didn't fool anybody. Exercise step didn't really fool anyone at all. But the amazing thing to me today is that probably 60 or 70 countries still use it to this day. That came as really an eye-opener to me. I had no idea that anyone would find any reason to continue this tradition, but it is continued. Speaking of the 26 infantry divisions around West Berlin, we used to joke with what the Berliners call gallows humor, black humor, that if World War III were to have broken out, if it had been Red Storm rising through the Fulda Gap, we were very confident that we would be among the absolute first casualties, because all it would take is 1 or 2 artillery shells lobbed into Teufelsberg, and boom, all of a sudden the army goes deaf. We have no more intercept. Do the same thing down to Augsburg. It's a little bit larger, a longer range, and all of a sudden, most of your listening capability would have disappeared. We hoped that that really wouldn't happen, and fortunately, it did not happen. Next slide, please. And then there were the border guards. These people, although they were not a potent war-making force, had the potential to cause international incidents. And that was something that we always cared about. Border violations, shootings, anything involving the potential for allies being involved in such things, whether they be tourists or military people. We kept strong eyes on all of the East German border guards. Now, this is a bridge made very famous recently in the Tom Hanks movie by the same name. It's been around for a long time. It was, of course, made famous with the spy swaps of the 1960s through the 80s, most famously with Gary Powers and Rudolf Abel on the other side. Later on, I was here and actually watched when Nathan Sharansky was freed, one of the refuseniks of the Soviet Union. Many other folks were traded across the bridge here. Now, what you see in this picture, on the left side is West Berlin. But as you go across the middle of the bridge, and there was a demarcation line there painted in white, and many folks re-enlisted right there in the middle of the bridge, because the general rule was in Berlin, you were allowed to re-enlist pretty much anywhere you wanted. And so many people thought this had some historical significance, and it certainly did. But on the far side, you're not looking into East Berlin. Now you're looking into East Germany, and more specifically into the town of Potsdam. So the Bridge of Spies separated West Berlin from East Germany. The Berlin Wall itself, which we'll talk about in just a minute, actually had only 27 miles of wall separating West Berlin from East Berlin. The rest of it was walls, but it separated us in West Berlin from the country of East Germany. So let's take a look at a couple of maps here that'll help make this clearer for those of you who might not have spent too much time in Germany in the Cold War days. Next slide, please. All right, this is a good German map showing you the two Germanys. Obviously, the BRD, West Germany, is shown in blue here with the capital in Bonn, which was the capital from the 1940s until reunification, where I went to college. You can see the West German states demarcated here. There were 11 different West German states at the time. And the resulting occupation zones for the British, the French, and the Americans were all part of this blue side. The Americans had in effect, the lower half of the blue, we carved out just a little bit for the French in the area that borders France near Alsace-Lorraine, and the Brits had, in effect, the northern half. The Soviet zone of occupation is what you see here in pink or in red. So that was the Russian zone, which would become in time in 1949, East Germany, or the GDR in English, in German, DDR, Deutsche Demokratische Republik, and their capital was East Berlin, except that they never called it that. They called it Berlin, capital of the GDR. We in the West, we were West Berlin, but they were Berlin. They were the real country. So you can see on this map exactly what that LOL, luxury of location, was. Teufelsberg sits in the little blue box that's in Berlin there, the little part right below the sign Ost-Berlin. We were 110 miles inside communist country and only about 45 miles from the Polish border. So we actually had some Polish linguists assigned to our facility as well. The question becomes, though, well, how do you ever get out of Berlin? If you want to go visit West Germany or anywhere else, what do you do? And we'll talk about that one in just a minute, but I want to first zoom in now on Berlin. So this is the two Germanys. Here are the two Berlins. This is a really good, it's a little bit detailed, but it's a very good map to lay out a lot of different facts. The entire eastern half of Berlin fell to the Soviet Union as their zone. And the rest, the West, was split between the US, the French, and the Brits. Now you might say, well, that's not a very fair division here. My God, the Soviets got half of the whole thing and we had to split up our half 3 ways. They tried to split up the zones based on official districts of Berlin. Berlin in 1920 had been a group of about 20 little towns, cities, and sub-villages. They were all brought together into what was called Gross Berlin, and there were demarcation lines separating these former villages. So they tried to build the lines in order with that so that there'd be no massive splits. It made it easier for things like town halls. So the Soviet zone is East Berlin. You see that there on the right. And notice there's no wall between East Berlin and East Germany because you don't need it. It's all part of the East. It's over on the left side, the west side, where the excitement is. The wall, the famous wall, runs right down the middle of this map. And it's shown as sort of a pinkish looking wall. And these are the 27 miles of wall that separated West Berlin on the left from East Berlin on the right. This is the famous part of the wall. All the way around the rest of West Berlin, though, forming a huge letter C from the top all the way around the west and then down to the bottom, that was also a wall, but that separated West Berlin from the country of East Germany. And that was about 70 miles worth. So actually the most famous part of the wall only represents about 1/4 of the actual total length of the wall. And within the West, up in the top, you see Tegel Airport. It's in a gray area there. That was the civilian airport of Berlin for decades. Only 3 airlines were ever allowed to fly in. Each of the occupying powers got 1. So we had Brit Air, Air France, and lovely Pan American. Those were the Lufthansa was not allowed to fly into Berlin for 45 years. After the war, until reunification, there were no Lufthansa flights into the city. Tegel just closed recently, by the way, after an ungodly delay opening the brand new Berlin airport. It was only about something like 10 years delayed, I think, but it finally has opened. If you look down a little lower, right along the wall, there's a red arrow. That is Checkpoint Charlie, the most famous of them all. That is the demarcation line, which we'll see in the next couple of pictures, where Westerners and foreigners could cross either on foot or by vehicle into East Berlin. So that would be a place where we would go across as tourists if we wanted to spend part of a day there, whether you were a civilian tourist, as I did when I was in college, or in the military. You had to be in military uniform, of course. It was the only authorized crossing point into East Berlin for us military. Civilians could go across 2 other ways. They could take the U-Bahn, the subway, or they could take the S-Bahn, the above ground city rail, which was owned by East Germany, and get out at Friedrichstrasse in East Berlin. That was forbidden to us. If we had permission to go into East Berlin, it had to be through Checkpoint Charlie. Now, moving down lower near the bottom, you see a Roman numeral 1 down there. That is where my barracks was. That's where Andrews Barracks is, deep in the American sector. And moving up a little bit, you see a star in the woods there. That's Teufelsberg. Just happened to be located in the British sector of Berlin. So the French had the Roman numeral 3, the Brits had Roman numeral 2, and the Amis, as the Germans called us, had Roman numeral 1. And then finally, down in the lower left corner, the green arrow at the very bottom, that is Checkpoint Bravo. Everybody's heard of Checkpoint Charlie, but if you haven't been assigned to Berlin or to Germany, you probably haven't heard of the other two, Checkpoint Alpha and Checkpoint Bravo. Bravo is where vehicles and trains would leave West Berlin, heading out through East Germany, 110 miles to West Germany. And finally, the orange arrow over there on the far left, that is the Bridge of Spies. That is the Glienicke Brücke, which separates West Berlin from Potsdam. Potsdam is just at the far left side of this map. So you see, again, that separates West Berlin from the country of East Germany. Okay, let's go now and take a look at Checkpoint Charlie a little closer. Next slide. Here it is. This is the real thing. I took this picture myself in the late 1970s. The Allied checkpoint, you notice you've got the 3 Allied flags on the top and the famous sign just to the right of the little house there. You're now leaving the American sector. Zimmerstrasse, the famous street sign. And you can see in behind the American flag and behind the little hut there, a guard tower. Already we've got East German guard towers monitoring this place. It was not a famous place for escapes after about the first year or two of the wall. It was simply too famous. There were too many people around, too much attention. Only one very, very famous failed attempt took place here in 1962, when a young East German by the name of Peter Fechter was shot and was left to die in no man's land. The East Germans, he was still on East German territory, but they refused to come out and help him. And as a result, he died of his wounds there. Next slide, please. Here's another view of Checkpoint Charlie, and now you can actually look across into what is East Berlin. Literally in the center of this slide, you see the logo of East Germany, a little round yellow and red logo there. This is what today is Friedrichstrasse. If you go down this street today, you would certainly not see anything that looks at all like this. It's one of the ritziest areas of new built up Berlin. One thing I want to highlight here, though, is the brick down in the front, the lower front, near the 10 kilometer and stop sign. That is the actual demarcation line. That's where West and East meet. Notice where the Berlin Wall sits, about 50 feet in East Germany territory. A lot of people complained right after the wall went up, why didn't Kennedy do something? Why didn't he send in tanks and just rumble that darn wall down? It was nothing more than barbed wire in those days. Well, in effect, he would have been invading East Germany at that point because they were clever. They built the wall on their own territory. And if we had come and blown it down, what if they rebuild it 100 yards deeper into their own countryside? We would become ever more an invader, if you will. So they were smart. The wall is never built right on the true demarcation line. The wall was always some amount of yards inside East Germany just for their own, well, they were smart. They thought this through, realizing it's going to make it very hard for somebody to actually come to physically try to blow the thing down. All right, next slide, please. If you decided you wanted to leave Berlin, you needed to have special orders cut, and you could either take the train or you could drive out. Now we'll talk about driving out first. So here we are, we're almost ready to leave West Berlin, and we come to Checkpoint Bravo. You would pull off to the right where you see the little sign there that says Allied Checkpoint Bravo. You'd go upstairs and the MPs would give you a booklet with instructions on exactly where you had to turn. You had to make 3 important turns on the Autobahn in East Germany to not end up in Poland, let's say, or Dresden or Leipzig. So you had to really read this carefully. They gave you specific details on what to do if you were detained by an East German or a Russian. They really made it pretty much idiot-proof, except, as you know, every time you make something a little more idiot-proof, they build a better idiot. And so there were stories all the time of people ending up at the Polish border being turned back, and made for a little minor excitement for whoever was involved with it that day. Once you left here, you would drive into East Germany, and for the next 110 miles, you were inside a communist country. You were forbidden from ever leaving the Autobahn except to pull off at a rest stop. And you can imagine, especially if you had a car that was even remotely stylish, and by this I'm talking about my 1983 Datsun B310 Honeybee, that was considered a macho power machine in East Germany. And when I pulled off at the rest stops, oh my God, they'd come and gawk at this car. It was about the size of the smallest Kia you could buy today, and yet for an East German, this was something to see. Their cars, Trabants and Wartburgs, Trabant the famous one, of course, the two-stroke engine, built primarily of a fiberglass fiberboard body, would overheat so badly that you would see at the rest stop mostly East German cars with the hood up. They were simply cooling off their engine. They couldn't drive more than 50, 60 miles without having to pull off and give the engine a break. When you would buy your car, by the way, you wouldn't get it for about 10 years. You'd be on a waiting list and you had no choice of color or anything else. Now, here's where the excitement comes. Once you left checkpoint Bravo, next slide, please. This is a picture looking north into Berlin from East Germany. So that checkpoint Bravo we just saw is right about in the middle of this picture, that thing going across the highway. That's that red and white building we just saw. What you're seeing here is a Stau, a backlog of cars as they're heading into West Berlin. I can't explain why there's such a backlog going in, except maybe they were doing a customs check, or maybe there was some incident. But you'll notice there's not very much traffic going out of West Berlin. And you'll see the wall on the bottom half of this picture. And yet you think, well, wait a minute, the Autobahn right there, there's no wall right there. So why doesn't an East German just get onto that road and then walk or pedal or jog as fast as you can, and you're across into the west? There's a hole in the wall. Well, the problem is there's no access to the highway. You can see the wall, in fact, at the bottom here on both sides of the highway. Now, before I tell you what it was like to process through the Soviets, I want to draw your attention to something on the lower right side, raised up on a small platform there. That is a T-34 tank. Right after the Soviets took over their part of Germany, and of course everything on the lower half of this slide is their part of Germany, I guess they wanted to keep sticking it in your face that they had won the war and all of that. We joked and said it was kind of a unique way to say, welcome to the GDR, hope you have a good time. It's very rare in America to cross a state line and have somebody mount a tank there, but that's what they thought would be a clever way to say, welcome, hope you have a really, really good time in the workers' paradise. What we would do now is we're driving toward the bottom of this slide, there would be a side road that would fork off only for Allies. All West Germans and trucks and transit people, they would process through the East Germans in East Germany. We, though, because of the four-power agreement involving Berlin and the checkpoints, would only process through a Soviet checkpoint. So we would pull off the road, and how many of you can say you've ever done this? One of the unique things of living in Berlin. The driver gets out of the car with his flag orders, and we'll see flag orders in just a minute. He walks up to the Soviet private, it's always a private, slick sleeve, and you salute the Russian. How many people do you know who have saluted a Russian E-1? We did it every single time we passed through East Germany. He would look at your flag orders very studiously, very seriously. He probably knew almost no English. He would just check the license plate number, would hand them back, and he'd say, "Пожалуйста," and point toward a little shed across the road. The driver, and only the driver, would enter the shed with these pieces of paper and would put them in a slot. You couldn't see who was behind the wall. You'd put them in a slot. The papers would be taken away. You'd hear radio traffic going on back there. The guy outside was reporting the vehicle, how many people were in it, all of that. And if, of course, we never let on we knew Russian, you dummied up, and you never wanted anybody to come out that door to talk to you, because that could be a security incident or a counterintelligence issue. So you just bided your time there, waited, and then you'd hear They'd be stamped, things would come back out, and you take your papers back outside to the Russian, salute him smartly again. He would look at your papers, give them back, he'd salute you back in your car, and off you go for 110 miles through East Germany. And then you'd be at checkpoint Alpha at Helmstedt at the far end. Now you're done with East Germany, ready to enter West Germany. And the same kabuki dance would happen again. You'd pull off with the papers, they would check the stamps and everything. Finally, after that last stop, you were free to go do your business in West Germany. Next slide, please. This is what you had to have to travel. On the left-hand side is what the Russians call a putyovka. It's in English, it's in French, and it's in Russian. Notice it's not in German because East Germans have nothing to do with these checkpoints. This is the 4 Allied powers. And it gives all your personal information, your license plate number or your passport number, and then it is stamped as you leave Berlin and as you arrive at West Germany, and then if you come back, the same. You can see that it's stamped at the bottom by Major General Boatner, who was the commandant of the American sector back in those days in the mid-1980s. On the right-hand side, you've got a fascinating document. This is the little pamphlet that was given to everyone traveling on the US duty train. Let me give you a minute to read the right-hand side, the thing that says as a matter of interest. Duty trains were around from the get-go, from day one. And there actually were 4 of them. We had 2. One of them, the primary one, went out to Frankfurt. It would leave in the evening, go through the East German countryside in the darkness, and then make its way down. And in the morning, you'd wake up and you'd be in Frankfurt. A much smaller one went north up to Bremerhaven, and the only time you'd ever take that one would be to pick up your POV at the port there. That's where all cars were delivered from the US. The Brits had a duty train. It only went out as far as Hanover, but it went out in the daytime. So if you were lucky, you could go out and maybe see some Soviet troops on maneuvers near the train tracks if you were lucky. And the French had the most exotic of all. Theirs went all the way down to Strasbourg in France. You were able to take these anytime you wanted. They were free of charge. You just had to get your paperwork in order. I love the rules here for the traveling by train, most especially Rule G there. Jumping on or off the moving trains is prohibited. You know, darn it, I lived my whole life dreaming that I could jump off a moving US Army train in the middle of the night in East Germany. I really felt like my life has been stifled, I guess you'd say. I'm not a complete person because of that rule, but you have to do what you have to do. So this was the kabuki dance that would happen anytime you decided to travel out to freedom, out to West Germany. For people who were stationed in West Germany, it was a little bit more of a challenge for them to get the paperwork to come visit us in Berlin. We actually had it comparatively a little easier. Next slide, please. This is a gentleman that some of you may know. In my book, you'll notice that as a young enlisted man, we tended to take a dim view of anybody who outranked us. I guess that's kind of Army tradition. We didn't like NCOs. We didn't like officers much. We had nothing against them, honestly. We just didn't like their rank. But when you really gave them a fair chance, you got to know them, people like this gentleman, Colonel Chuck Eichelberger, it was darned hard to not like him. First of all, he was one of us. He started as an enlisted Morse operator. I mean, we linguists don't like Morse operators that much. You hate everybody, but he was an enlisted guy like us, and you had to love him. He was a great commanding officer, and I'm sure many of you listening tonight remember him and know that he went on to get 3 stars. Very interesting as to where he lived in Berlin when he was the field station commander. As an 06, he was one of the highest ranking people in the city, and where we lived in Berlin was the old Mansion district, owned by very, very rich Jews and others, and then taken over by the Nazis. And then when they were gone, taken over by the US Army. His house was the mansion that was owned by Admiral Karl Dönitz of the Third Reich. He, in his oral history of his career, which is a fascinating thing to read online, tells that it had 36 rooms and the kitchen alone was over 50 feet long. This was not like my barracks room, let's put it that way, but just an absolute gentleman. And as I say, we poked fun all the time of officers, but when you got to know people like Chuck Eichelberger, when you got to know people like Captain Dick Quirk, it honestly was very difficult to not like them. They were true gentlemen, and we were proud to serve along with these people. Next slide. But here's somebody I was not proud to serve alongside. How many of you can say, first of all, how many of you can say you've saluted a Russian private? How many of you can say you worked for 3 years about 40 feet away from a spy? That's what I did. When I came back to Berlin as an NSA civilian after I got out of the Army, this fellow was assigned there at the same time I was. He was an NCO at the field station from 1982 to 85. He, unfortunately, had access to the crown jewels. One of his tasks as a staff officer was he was in charge of monitoring all of the US signals intelligence directives and the national intelligence priority lists. He had everything that said what we do, how we do it, who we care about, who we don't care about. He simply would come in on the weekends, use the Xerox machine. He was very clever. He double dipped. He sold them to the Soviets and the East Germans. I'm sure the Soviets would have given them to the East Germans free of charge, but he charged double. So give him credit for that, but not much else. He would be arrested later on in 1988. Actually, he was sentenced just weeks before the wall came down. He was doing things like buying Volvos and fancy pickup trucks and paying in cash in Georgia. He was arrested in late 1988 and he was sentenced to 40 years. He was released in 2011 after 22 years. When he was asked in an interview, did you consider yourself a spy? He said, no, I considered myself a treasonous bastard. And all of us who had anything to do with him, I think would be certainly in complete agreement with that. The other tragedy that happened while I was in Berlin as a civilian took place in March 1985. And this was the murder of Major Art Nicholson, a member of the USMLM, the US military liaison mission, who was killed by a Soviet sentry near Ludwigslust, about 100 miles northwest of Berlin, while he was on a totally legitimate mission along with his driver, an NCO. Soviets shot him, did not allow the NCO to provide any medical relief, and he died. When the body was brought back to Berlin, the commander of the unit, Colonel Roland LaJoy, who is my wife's uncle, well, let's just say things were a little bit fractious when the body was turned back. This was the first real challenge to Gorbachev's serving as the head of the Communist Party. This was the first crisis of his tenure, you might say. And it was viewed as an absolute tragedy by all of us who were stationed in Berlin at the time. Things like this just were not supposed to happen. Well, in 1989, I was back at NSA, had been back for a couple of years, and decided one more PCS to Germany, let's go to Stuttgart. So I took an assignment working for a fellow by the name of Bill Black. We were at Patch Barracks providing NSA support to US UCOM. Now remember, picture this, summer 1989. We said, let's go back to Berlin. Let's fly there on a big weekend, a 3-day weekend, and see our old haunting grounds. We had 2 little kids with us. We said, fine, what day? How about Veterans Day, November? That'll be a good time to fly to Berlin. November 10th, 1989. We flew into Berlin the day the wall opened. And all I can say is it was yet another one of those experiences that I will never forget, that made Berlin absolutely unique. Being there during the time when the wall was up, and then being there literally the day, in effect, it came down. Next slide. This is what it looked like a year later. Actually, in those days, it was great because you could go and get all kinds of chunks of wall yourself. You didn't have to buy these little pieces that were painted where they charge you $10 and you don't know if it's made in Taiwan or it's the real thing. I have some chunks because they were, as you can see, littered. They were everywhere, really easy to get the chunks. And it stayed this way for about a year until all of it was torn down. And today there are only a couple token sections left as kind of a museum so people can see what it really did look like in the day. Next slide. Well, it's a different Berlin today. I'm very proud of this picture. I took this when I was there on business, TDY, about 4 years ago. And boy, there aren't many days in Berlin where the weather is quite like this, but there it was for me. And so I took this postcard picture. It is a brave new world in Berlin. It is a different feel. Some of us say we kind of miss the old days, but that's kind of a human tendency, I guess, isn't it? No doubt that it was absolutely exciting. And as I write at the end of my book, there are probably a lot of my former roommates and friends in college who ended up getting jobs with more prestige, made a lot more money, had a lot more creature comforts. And even though being a lawyer, being a doctor, being a realtor, those are all honorable professions, I always felt like what I chose to do, what I happened to do, what I lucked into doing, how I got just so fortunate to be able to do it, was something where I think maybe in a tiny, tiny way, I and all of those hundreds of people who served before me, with me, and after me, we did our own little tiny bit to help win the Cold War, I hope. I like to think. Next slide. Well, here's where you can read more. This is my book, available on Amazon, self-published a couple of years ago. I warn my senior Army readers, again, remember now, this is written in sometimes rather humorously, poking fun at a lot of things that we E5s thought were kind of dumb in the Army, but it's meant with absolute love and endearment as well. And it explains so many of the adventures and many, many other tales that I don't have time to share with you here today. It's about 390 pages with some pictures. And I encourage you, if you want to learn more, or if you were there, you want to take a stroll down memory lane, you might find that this helps you do that. So at this point in time, I believe my role here as the solo artist is over, and I'm going to turn it over now and see what questions you might have.
It's one, people commented that we lost sound, and once or twice you did lose sound, but I think we got it back over the last 2/3. Where and when did you first learn German?
I studied German at Ripon College in Wisconsin for 2 years, and then again made that plunge to take the junior year in Germany. And for any of you who've studied language, you know what I'm talking about. You can study till you're blue in the face 4 years at college here. Go live in the country for 6 months or a year and see what happens. So I went there as a pretty poor German-speaking 19-year-old and came home fluent. So that's really where I learned it, was that junior year at the university in Bonn.
Where did you grow up, though?
I grew up in Los Gatos, California, only about an hour from DLI, which meant that when I went to basic training in Fort Ord, yet again, how many people can say this? I got to go home once, one weekend during basic training. It was only about 35, 40 minutes away. So what a luxury to be able to go home and go to the bathroom and close the door and have a home cooked meal and not have to eat it in 4 minutes. I mean, it was pretty exciting. So I grew up in near the redwoods of Santa Cruz, California.
Did they teach German in your high school?
Yes, they did. I took 1 year. I took 3 years of Latin and then decided this is great if I ever meet Julius Caesar, but assuming I don't, maybe I ought to try something different. And so I took 1 year of German and took 2, and I just had a kind of a knack for languages. And that's what led me to take a couple more years at Ripon. And then, well, that put me on the path.
I saw that you were a speechwriter. I know that's not part of your real book, but describe being a speechwriter for the head of the NSA.
This is a daunting task. You're being asked to write a speech. You're told by someone on his staff, the director, Admiral McConnell, is going down to the annual AFCEA dinner at CIA, or he's going to some think tank, he's going to RAND or somewhere else, and he would like you to write a 30-minute speech on signals intelligence in the 21st century. That's it. No further specifications except the time limit and the general topic. I don't know whether he likes to tell jokes. Does he like anecdotes? Does he like 25-cent words? Does he like short sentences? So you literally just take a stab at it and throw it into the pot. And what made me a little bit frustrated was between me, the writer, and the Admiral, the director of NSA, 11 people had a chance to review that document and comment on it. And I have to admit, I had a little bit of pride of ownership when people would say, don't say this, say this. And I was tempted to say, is that you speaking or is that the director? If it's the director speaking, it's changed. But if that's your opinion, what if he does like it this way? So it was definitely a daunting challenge, but I enjoyed it very much. I've always liked speech writing for myself and for others. So it was fun, but not easy.
Now, somebody who's happy to glad, I can understand how some of your higher ups wanted to change sometimes words sometimes. What did you do when you were the intelligence advisor to the U.S., EUCOM, and NATO international military staff? Was that one of your second trips going back to?
That was my final PCS assignment. That was from 2008 to 2012. My wife worked at SHAPE in the counterintelligence organization there, and I worked in Brussels. So we split the difference. We lived in Waterloo, about 1 kilometer from the battlefield. I was, if you can believe it, I never really thought this was sound OPSEC, but my business card said I was the chief of SIGINT Section Brussels. So there it was, right out there on the business card, exactly what I was there to do. We were there to provide as much NSA intelligence support as we could to NATO deployed elements, primarily in Afghanistan and in the Balkans at that time.
Somebody wants to go back. The sound was a little bit shaky during the Lutz story. I guess back then you didn't have your iPhone that you could take out and Google Lutz and automatically come up with a city in Poland. When you started that story, I did it, and it worked quite well. But they would like to hear the Lutz story one more time.
Oh. So seeing something where someone said there's going to be a Warsaw Pact meeting in Lodz, and I thought, this is ridiculous. There can't be an East German. We're listening to East Germans. There can't be an East German town called Lodz. There's just, I know German towns. There's no such place. I listened to it and imagine my surprise. This doesn't sound like Lodz. It sounds like Wuch. And now I'm really puzzled. You know, am I on candid camera? I mean, neither one of them makes any sense. So I did my best to find some East German location, but trust me, there are no East German towns that sound like Wuch or Lodz. And then turned in the paperwork to the NSA civilian who is the quality controller, the QC. And he's the one who told me very, very politely that since I didn't know Polish, he would help me out a little, took me to a map, this massive map of the Warsaw Pact. And right there in the middle is Poland. And right there in the middle is this huge city south of Warsaw called Łódź. And he explained to me that since I didn't know Polish, if I had, I would have known exactly that Lodz is Łódź, but I did not know that. And so, as I say, I learned a lesson in humility, and I learned a lesson in learning the NSA civilian's handwriting, so you don't make this mistake again. And I didn't.
I hope that answers your question, Don. This question is from Ed. How effective was Russian intelligence against the USA? Did they ever talk to you about what you had to be careful about?
That would have had nothing to do with my job. We had all the typical CI things, and the worst thing that could ever happen, ever, would be any Russian or East German approaching you, even if they didn't say who they were, maybe in a bar, and somebody comes up and says they want to know where you work, or tell me a little bit more about your job, or can I buy you a girl, or something like that. That would be the worst thing that could happen, because we were all trained. You had to go and report, self-report immediately. Imagine my surprise when I actually had an episode like this, unlike any other, coming home as a civilian through East Germany in a snowstorm. Our car was involved in an accident. And when we got to the checkpoint, the car was clearly badly damaged. My wife stayed in the car with the baby, but the snow was coming into the car. I was in handing the paperwork out, and the Russian officer came out the door. You never want to see that, ever. You don't want them to see you, vice versa. You have to dummy up. You don't know a word of German, don't know a word of Russian. You're just a, I don't know, member of the army band. I don't know what. My wife broke all protocol rules. She brought the baby into the shack. You're not supposed to do that. That's against all rules. She said, it is cold out there and it's snowing. The Russian officer, he took my son in his arms, and he sang some sort of Russian lullaby. So my son, for the rest of his life, before he died last year, could say, how many people do you know who've been serenaded by a Russian officer? So yeah, that was the thing you dreamed of not having happen, though, is coming into any contact with them, because it would be your ticket out of Berlin. If they felt there was a CI risk, they would simply reassign you somewhere. And we knew how good we had it in Berlin.
So it was constantly beating to your head.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well, that's it for questions. What closing comments would you like to make?
Well, a couple of them. One, I thank the United States Army for putting me on a path, a glide path that allowed me to have a 45-year career, even though 41 of those years was with the National Security Agency. None of that would have happened had it not been for that assignment in Berlin that started the whole ball rolling. Another final message I would say is, like so many of us as we get a little bit older in this business, we never knew how easy and good we had it at the time. We thought that our job was tough, going against fixed microwave communications, enemies that wore uniforms with ranks and everything else. You knew where their barracks were. We never knew how easy we had it in those days. And Lord knows the world has changed for people doing my line of work who have to do it now against terrorists and cyber criminals and everything else. They probably wish they could go back in time to the days that I was able to experience.
Well, we just got a flood of questions, not questions, and commentary, how happy people are about this talk tonight. It brought back floods of memories for many of the people who served in Germany and may have served over in Berlin. One last question though, how was Hall discovered?
Surprised. Anybody who's been in Berlin or in these things, it'll bring back some happy and poignant memories of interesting, exciting times.
How was Hall discovered?
Something tells me it was the business about buying a big fancy Volvo and a pickup truck and paying in cash. That probably set somebody looking a little bit, but I believe I'm correct in saying, unfortunately, a polygraph didn't catch him. As a man who had to take polygraphs for 45 years, sadly, to the best of my knowledge, polygraphs haven't caught many spies, unfortunately. Usually it takes stupidity on their part or a tip-off from the other side. And I don't know the details, but I believe that it may have been a combination of somebody tipping us off, or it may have just been his own stupidity, which is a common way for it to happen.
Yeah. You had a different experience. I was assigned out of Hawaii. Our linguists spent a lot of time working counter narcotics coming out of the Philippines, coming out of Korea. They didn't get to do, they spent a lot of time actually in drug interdiction efforts, not necessarily listening to North Koreans or Chinese or even Russians in that area. So you seem to have a much more entertaining effort in your service.
You know, it's kind of exciting. You're living about 5-6 miles from your target country, from East Germany. You can read their newspapers every day. They're available in West Berlin. You can watch their television, assuming you have a high threshold for boredom, high threshold. You can monitor them. You can follow them. You can begin to learn a little bit about their life. And it just makes it much easier to be a professional going against those people as a target.
Well, thank you. I'm going to give you a call here in a second, but I want to thank you for a great, entertaining, and educational walk through a part of the world that many of us would like to sometimes see again. It was clear who our enemies were,
Yes.
but for a really entertaining talk tonight. So thanks, and
well, thank you for the opportunity for me to do this, and to my friends, the Delaney's, for helping to make this happen. I really do appreciate it very, very much.
We're good, and we look forward to the next book.
Thank you.
No pressure. Talk to you later.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.